Editor's Foreword to The Civil War and Reconstruction in Alabama by Walter Linwood Fleming. Foreword by George Bagby. Epigraph. If history is best understood as a story, at least two things follow. First, a story, like that of the Alamo, is somebody's story. It is not everybody's story, as is claimed by those with an agenda, whether they be nationalist ideologues or multiculturalists. Everybody can learn from a story, but if it is to be real and valid, it is some people's story. Clyde Wilson, Dean of Southern Historians. Reconstruction is the single most confusing and controversial period in American history. The tinderbox of race relations and the new organization of the central government and the states were not reformed reasonably or to the satisfaction of anyone involved, or to any faction that engages the history today. Explanations and justifications for the extreme policies, punitive laws, and social experimentation of this period were, in summary, counterproductive to anything but a radical centralization of power in Washington. Ironically, the greatest advocates for ideological centralized planning are the most vocal in their dissatisfaction with their progenitors. Communists and leftists openly lament that white Southerners were not herded into literal gulags or forced to immigrate. Conservative nationalists are so appalled with the record of cynicism and corruption in the carpetbag governments and the Republican-dominated federal government that they struggle to maintain a thesis that any form of representative government endured it. Old Republicans of Jefferson's school can only see the period as an assault on antebellum American institutions and a less bloody form of warfare on American social life. Advocates of universal suffrage and post-ethnic utopianism find nothing but duplicitous policies forced on disenfranchised citizens. Progressives usually salve their consciences by dismissing the relevance of the ex-Confederate whites of the South. Dissatisfaction so universal has left the period neglected, and for the past several decades dominated by openly Marxist historians. The progressive dominance of academia and popular memory has created an establishment interpretation, blinders that confuse needful questions and modes of inquiry about this important period. Indeed, the ideological tendencies of the establishment, in the words of Eric Voegelin, involve forbidding questions and demanding a priori assent to various ideological notions. This approach is the antithesis of historical inquiry, but establishment historians such as Howard Zinn, Kenneth Stamp, and Eric Foner have all revealed the insecurity of their notional positions by branding their rivals with the rhetorical devil words of our age. They must cancel and malign alternatives to their own ideological vision. For permitting those essential questions and evidence about Reconstruction and the Civil War might lead to conclusions like those of the great Henry Adams of Massachusetts, who wrote that the progress of evolution from President Washington to President Grant was alone evidence to upset Darwin. Adams was a witness to a qualitative decline, anathema to the fundamental notions of all progressives. Yet this wisdom, so well known to the ancient world and yet so exotic to Americans, is a tonic for the perplexed, now that civilizational decline is a popular subject again. The key divergence of thought lies in the ideological, a priori approach to the past and the experience-based, a posteriori approach, which must take into account the irrational, organic, unchosen realities of human life. Zinn and Foner, while openly Marxist in conviction, have preyed on the timid liberals of America because liberalism itself is ideological and adverse to conversation about what experience reveals of its assumptions. The proposition of the Declaration, that all men are equal in some sense, is a basic notion in both Marxism and liberalism, and although these ideologies claim to desire different ends, liberal regimes cannot offer any resistance to ideologues of conviction and action. American institutions have been subverted and conquered by leftists in this way. American liberalism already assumed a vision of progress in history, the Whig interpretation of history, that time tracks the inevitable ascent towards enlightenment, is the dominant view. Marx shared this view and said the goal of history is the communist utopia. American liberals believe in progress as a Christian believes in God, but cannot effectively object to Marx and critical theory to their left. American liberals will not forbid policies or professors to their left because of their uncertainty, but they have no compunction about thinkers on the right. The Marxists have spirit and vision, where the liberals can only offer timid uncertainty and a vague faith in inevitable improvement. The essential element of the a priori approach is conviction about what society ought to be, what the American dream or the American ideal must be, and whether or not a certain leader or law or event lived up to the ideal. This approach to the United States has abstracted the American peoples into the exceptional nation, a post-ethnic and ideological nation. In Lincoln's words, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. For these men, Lincoln is a prophet delivering a new covenant to America. James McPherson referenced the fundamental constitutional changes of the war by terming it a Second American Revolution. Eric Foner calls it Lincoln's second founding of the United States. Lincoln's vision thus often influences the writing of the antebellum history of America, as the ideologues assume the inevitable destiny of a United States with universal suffrage, a central bank that governs world finance, a military stationed in hundreds of countries, open borders, defunded police, and institutionalized transsexualism for children. No right-thinking historian of the 1860s ought to be preoccupied with the nonsense that troubles Americans in the present day. The historian's task is rather to see the events of his period of study with the eyes of those who experienced the events, to understand the circumstances the way the participants understood them, and to attempt to reenact in his own mind the choices made in the past. The refreshing alternative to this blinkered state of affairs is the so-called Dunning School of Reconstruction. Inspired by Professor William A. Dunning of Columbia University, this circle of students were inspired by Dunning's compelling insistence on the mastery of primary sources and eyewitness accounts, combined with a scientific approach of testing hypotheses with the evidence. Dunning had been educated partly in Berlin and had been highly influenced by John Burgess, an American professor of political science who shared the German notion of objective and scientific approaches to history. Dunning authored several works on Reconstruction, but his students and disciples found popular and scholarly fame. Aside from the unparalleled strength in primary source evidence, the Dunning School frankly communicates the history grounded in the primary sources of the particular time and place. These scholars successfully reproduced the beliefs, feelings, and experiences of various southern and northern states during this important period. While Foner and Stamp can communicate well about how a modern leftist or Marxist feels about Reconstruction, the Dunning historians give the perspective of the Americans of the era, especially the white Southerners so recently defeated, wounded, and fleeced in the war. The establishment can tell us what we were supposed to say about the period to earn the proper brownie points, and woe betide anyone who strays from the script. The Dunning School historians offer the experiences of normal people for normal people today, and there is no catechism of leftist doctrines to memorize. Not surprisingly, these histories have been removed from libraries and kept out of print, but that has not proved to be enough. They are ritually denounced by the encyclopedias and reference books, warning the curious away from the contagion of wrong think. The time has come to make these histories accessible again. The Dunning School men present the story of Southerners from the extant sources. They do not psychoanalyze their sources, accuse them of false consciousness, or condemn them as enemies of the people, as the Marxist is obliged to do. Instead, they present their beliefs, choices, and reactions in the realistic context of the place and time. The particular strength of these writers is in the astonishing quantity of sources they summarized, analyzed, and quoted. Their works remain the first depositories for any scholar looking for the primary sources. In addition, each historian focused on particular states and focused their efforts on the peculiarities of a place. Each history is a valuable contribution to a historiography of regionalism. Walter Linwood Fleming, the preeminent historian of the Dunning School, was a native of Alabama and the son of a Confederate veteran. Born in 1874 under the carpetbag government, Fleming was a childhood eyewitness to the events he spent his career chronicling. His history is full of footnotes documenting interviews, making him an unsung pioneer of oral history. Fleming was educated at Auburn and taught high school history until the Spanish-American War, when he enlisted in an Alabama regiment. He was given a commission and elevated to second lieutenant, where he commanded a platoon of black Alabamans as a white officer. He did not see service abroad, but had his first major opportunity to travel and live outside of his native state. He left the service as the war concluded and enrolled in Columbia University to study history under Dunning, where he earned a second MA, a PhD, and again served as a teacher. It was during these years that he composed his thesis, what he would later release as his major work. Fleming started his career as a college professor in 1904 at the University of West Virginia in Morgantown. There he accumulated further evidence for the Civil War and Reconstruction in Alabama, and Columbia University published it. This work established his reputation as a scholar in the field and enabled him later to edit and assemble the documentary History of Reconstruction, 1906, which is the indispensable and authoritative reference for all subsequent historians of the period. Fleming is often disparaged today for his so-called white supremacist bigotry. What Fleming offers is a frank analysis of a primitive and largely illiterate people, the black Alabamans, who were suddenly emancipated, enfranchised, and made the political pawns of the Republican Party. Based as he is in the primary sources, he freely quotes and often shares the disgust and dissatisfaction of his subjects with this policy. He offers a surprising advantage over many modern writers on this period. Fleming wrote in a time when an academic was permitted to openly prefer European civilization, and had no fear of doing so. Anyone who attempts this frank preference today is canceled and hounded out of all employment. Fleming's own beliefs on racial differences and the multiracial character of the South may be gleaned from his commentary. He believed, like Lincoln and Lee, that the African benefited from inclusion into Anglo-American society. He believed Christianity, literacy, and the improved quality of life were praiseworthy and durable improvements that Americanized the African, a point shared by Martin Luther King Jr. Fleming is on the record preferring literacy to illiteracy, Christian marriage to concubinage, religious leadership for the seminary educated, and other cultural points. He also believed the black Alabaman capable of achievement and participation in all of these things, although most did not participate in them. The fact that any of these observations or preferences would destroy the man daring enough to make them today does not disprove the truth. In spite of what might be said of slavery and the well-known disparities of our own day, African Americans in the United States enjoy the highest quality of life of members of their race, and this is because of proximity to and adoption of Anglo-American norms and institutions. The well-known racial tensions, conflict, and fears make this fact all the more remarkable. The long history of black dissatisfaction and activism to break free from this power dynamic and establish an identity derived from, parallel to, or separate from the Anglo-American norms is itself an American epic. Fleming took a special interest in schemes to sift and separate the races as a solution to the race problem in a dedicated monograph published in 1914. And there he cataloged the follies of Lincoln's efforts to colonize the black freemen and the earlier disasters in the establishment of Liberia. Lincoln asserted in public speeches that the African did not have a future inside of the United States, which was a popular opinion at that time and won Lincoln credit in important circles. Fleming himself had more in common with Lee and Jefferson Davis, who thought colonization inhumane and imagined a common, yet hierarchical, future with the black slaves and freemen. Fleming was a mild liberal on the race question of his day, and a fair historian of more radical notions in more volatile times. Moreover, the practice of labeling writers and thinkers as white supremacist or racist is done in bad faith. No member of the establishment would think of canceling Abraham Lincoln, for instance, as a white supremacist, although we can easily catalog quantities of public statements of his which would cancel anyone today on the question of race. He may yet be canceled, but his rhetoric will not be the reason for it. No, white supremacy is a weaponized term for the use of leftist activists to control thought and destroy their enemies. Fleming took it for granted that American institutions had been constructed by Anglo-Americans to suit themselves. He understood Reconstruction as a grotesque anomaly in which the Anglos of Alabama were disenfranchised and exploited by the military subversion of the institutions they had constructed. Few Americans of Fleming's day disagreed with this thesis, and viewed Reconstruction as a tragic era in which the machinery of government was used for personal enrichment and citizenship was redefined under a military dictatorship rather than through a political process. John Burgess, in his important History of Reconstruction in 1902, illustrates the position by calling Reconstruction an error as well as a failure, and noting the necessity of the North to own the fact. One major difference between now and Fleming's time is that Americans are more likely to see the radical extension of the franchise to the mostly illiterate freemen as idealistic, and the disenfranchisement of ex-Confederates as deserved punishment. Even the establishment of Fleming's own day were more likely to see the former as cynical and the latter as dishonorable and counterproductive to the peace of the Union. In the words of the historian Jeffrey Hummel, the war had emancipated the slaves, but Reconstruction had enslaved free men. The association of the races is a major concern in this book, as it remains in American society today. Reconstruction began a new regime of race relations, which was more anarchic than orderly. Just as emancipation was made policy by force in a time of war, so enfranchisement and the proclamation of social equality were made outside of the political process and under coercion. Oddly enough, the abolition of slavery meant the end of another sort of racial integration and association. As Leon Litwack notes in his book, North of Slavery, the racial segregation regime had been invented in the states that had abolished slavery before the war and where slavery had never been a legal institution. Slavery itself was not conducive to social separation or apartheid because the institution required close proximity to function. The triumph of the Union meant the eventual importation of Northern conventions, something eventually formalized in the Jim Crow regime, as C. Van Woodward records. However much the end of slavery is praised, no statesman had planned what followed. Jim Crow filled a vacuum a generation later. Fleming's history illustrates the countless schemes of racial integration, reconciliation, and vengeance of a time when few social norms were unassailable. Although the end of hostilities signaled the resumption of policy by mutual consent and of politics, the martial law regime and the disenfranchisement of most white men prevented politics from resuming in the South. Fleming's meticulous documentation of the rise of the Union Leagues, the Ku Klux Klan, and other paramilitary and secret societies is of enduring interest and importance, and must be understood in the context of the unique incentives that created these movements. Vigilantism and terrorism were not confined to one side of these conflicts, and the context of the Klan's activities deserves special attention. Reconstruction was an episode of despotism and anarchy amid dramatic changes in the nature of the Union and of American representative government. The notion of American exceptionalism has left many with a misleading idea that the Philadelphia Constitution has maintained an unchanging regime since 1787. Whereas the French have formalized 5 republics, the Americans have kept their constitutional changes informal. In fact, the historian can identify several distinct regimes, and we might identify antebellum America, broadly, as an Anglo-republic, which conserved rather than revolutionized English institutions by amputation in 1776, as M.E. Bradford had it. The Declaration itself contains much evidence for this interpretation, including the famous appeal to the consanguinity and common kindred of the English people, and the distinct disparagement and fear of domestic insurrections and the merciless Indian savages. The Declaration is largely a list of offenses against institutions of English origin, defended on Enlightenment Republican grounds, also thoroughly English. The Philadelphia Constitution shored up the interests of the Anglo establishment, the native elites who had organized to support their own interests for ourselves and our posterity. New York Federalist John Jay described this union as one of a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, and professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, and very similar in their manners and customs. The last and most controversial defense of this ancient regime was the Dred Scott decision of Justice Taney's court, which argued on the best assemblage of evidence that the founders and framers never intended to enfranchise slaves or Native Americans, but that states could expand the suffrage or amend the Constitution to do so. If Jay saw one people united in customs and political principles, the Americans of 1861 did not, and so the organic ethnogenesis, which could have resulted in a European-style political partition of America, was instead united by force with ideological justifications. One result of the Civil War, foreseen or not, was the abolition of the order just described, in which those who owned the country ought to govern it, in the words of Jay, with a new mandate of national unity and civil rights for the freemen, bypassing the enfranchisement of the Native Americans for another 2 generations. Lincoln's promise in the Gettysburg Address that we here highly resolve on a new birth of freedom is what M.E. Bradford characterized as a formula for a continuing revolution of American society, and a license for unlimited power to the central government for social experimentation and engineering on ideological lines. This is the origin of the political formulas that legitimize American institutions and programs in the eyes of the masses today. Lincoln justified his war to save the Union at first, and only later found it necessary to shore up his support at home and abroad by announcing the end of slavery in areas under Confederate control. Still later, in the Gettysburg Address, he revealed a more universal dedication to the proposition that all men are created equal. And finally, in the second inaugural, in which he remarkably posited that the abolition of slavery was the original cause and goal of the war, a goal not actually achieved until the ratification of the 13th Amendment by Southern state legislatures 8 months after Lincoln's death. Thus, in Reconstruction, it is not surprising that Union authorities often prioritized the economic goals of the Republican Party or their own personal enrichment over the more abstract and secondary racial equalitarianism. As Fleming well illustrates, many of the race policies could be interpreted as means to an end of the demoralization of the ex-Confederates and the greater advantage of enlisting the freemen as reliable Republican voters. The fact that so many of these pledges, rumors of property redistribution, and schemes for racial integration were abandoned or used cynically, while the Republican industrial and tax policies endured in law, is also evidence of the revealed preference. The radical leadership in Congress did not hide their base motives of revenge and pillage, and found waving the bloody shirt of low passions far better political currency than more enlightened appeals for the radical redistribution of wealth or land for the freemen. Wealth was certainly redistributed, but it went to the victors and the infamous carpetbagger. More important in the history of the Union is the narrative that joined North and South together after the war, what might be termed a nationalism, to distinguish it from the looser federalism before Lincoln's second founding in Foner's just phraseology. The total domination of the Republicans over all three branches of the federal government after Lincoln's nomination of Salmon P. Chase as Chief Justice in 1864 risked the advent of a one-party state, a goal openly advocated by Senator Thaddeus Stevens and others. The end of military government, the restoration of ex-Confederates to political office and the franchise, and the formal disbanding of the Klan that accompanied the end of military occupation was called the return to normal conditions by the nationalist Woodrow Wilson in his Division and Reunion, 1893. John Burgess, the professor of both Franklin and Theodore Roosevelt at Columbia, did not question the sincerity of Reconstruction policies, but declared them positively counterproductive to the goal of national unity between the white citizens of the North and South. Reconciliation between the sections meant the adoption of Southern heroes into a common national pantheon, and a new era of cooperation and a measure of prosperity shared with the South. This was a peace with honor for the defeated, and Southerners returned to service, as before, disproportionately filling the ranks of the military in infantry bases named after Southern as often as Northern generals. This former peace settlement, an actual realization of the malice towards none and charity for all among the white Americans who remained the principal actors of the drama and the overwhelming majority of residents in the Union, is obviously over. Another regime has taken its place, prioritizing the placement and status of minorities of all species and institutionalizing grievances. It is in this climate that Woodrow Wilson is as unwelcome a witness as Walter Fleming. Both men are honest and authoritative testaments of another time, in which heritage Americans retained a will to rule and saw no reason to shrink from their dominion. The sound historian does not find his bearing by the fashionable ideology, but by the organic realities of the period he studies. His task is not to credit or condemn past actions in reference to present politics or dogma, but to illustrate what was believed, what was chosen, and what was done in the circumstances of his chosen period. Fleming is a master of this academic approach, and he undeniably lends it the pathos of a native Alabaman, whose sources are respected elders. Fleming's achievement is beyond most historians. He intimately knows and sincerely loves the people who are his subjects. The sordid tale of Reconstruction is full of villains and men reduced to their lowest moments, and yet Fleming presents them humanely with mixtures of motives, and does not reduce or dismiss any personality with the rhetorical devil words that block the sentiments against understanding an unfamiliar and distant time. Our historian is a master of his craft, his material, and his place in the world. He well exemplifies Clyde Wilson's description of history as somebody's story. This is the tragic story of the people of Alabama between 1860 and the end of Reconstruction, and it is unmatched in excellence. George Bagby, Louisiana, summer of 2023. Look for Walter L. Fleming's Civil War and Reconstruction in Alabama, published by Tall Men Books, at your favorite bookseller. Thank you.